Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's discussion titled Independent Voters, Rising, Real, and Ready with Michael Smerconish. I'm Russell Daniels, the Digital Communications Director at Open Primaries. We're very excited for today's discussion between Michael Smerconish and our host, Open Primaries President John Opdycke, and the President of IndependentVoting.org, Jacqueline Salit. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over two quick pieces of business. One, there will be a Q&A portion in the second half of the discussion. So if you want to ask a question, please put your name, state, and a brief summary of your question in the chat. You can submit at any point during the conversation. And when it's time for the Q&A, our hosts will call on you. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. When we're going to try to fit in as many of those questions as possible. And second, please make sure that you are on mute for the entire discussion. There's a lot of us here, so it's really important to keep yourself muted until called on. So thank you so much for joining today, and I'm going to turn things over to Open Primaries President John Opdycke. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here today. I'm very excited to be joined by my dear friend and longtime colleague, Jackie Salit. As Russell mentioned, Jackie is the president of IndependentVoting.org. She's also the author of Independence Rising, which was published way back in 2012. It's a book that is a must read, and I think was about 10 years ahead of its time, Jackie. I don't know if you agree with me, but I certainly think it was it paved new ground in the discussion about independent voters. Jackie and I are very excited to be talking with Michael Smerconish today. Most of you know Michael as one of the most thought-provoking, politically incorrect, willing to go where the facts take him, serious analysts, pundits, political geniuses working in the media today. Yes, Michael, you have a certain touch of genius about you. He has a newspaper column in Philadelphia. He's nationally syndicated on XM Sirius Radio. He's also the host of CNN Smerconish, which airs Saturday mornings at 9 o'clock Eastern. And he's been someone way ahead of the curve when it comes to acknowledging and analyzing the possibilities and the potential of the rising independent voter class in this country. And Jackie and I are very excited to talk with you, Michael, about what you're seeing and what the possibilities are for the country, given that so many of us are leaving the political parties. So before we dive into the conversation, we wanted to show just a brief clip from a recent podcast interview you gave with Paul Rieckhoff. Go ahead, Russ.
In the most recent Gallup survey, they initially asked, are you an I, a D, or an R? And 42% said, I am an I, I'm an independent. And this part I don't like. Gallup then pushed them and said, yeah, okay, but which way do you lean? And then the story came out and the story said, oh, you know, the year began better for Democrats than it ended because here's what the party affiliation is between the R's and the D's. And I don't even remember the final number. It doesn't even matter to me. I was pissed that they had discounted the plurality who said, I'm an independent. And it's as if they didn't even exist. Okay, so I'm sure Gallup would say, well, a lot of people who claim they're independent like the panache of thinking that they are independent when in fact they're more an R or a D. That may apply to a lot of folks, but not to all 42% of us. I like that you acknowledged that I have lots of views. I have views on everything. They just don't line up neatly into an ideological box at one end of the spectrum or the other.
Very well said. Jackie, I actually was hoping you could kind of take point here, because I know you've written a lot about this thing that Michael was complaining about, the way that pollsters kind of use the question of leaners. So why don't you kick us off in the conversation here?
Great, happy to. And thank you, John. And hello to everyone. Great to be here with you. Michael, any independent who sees that clip will consider you a hero, because that refusal to acknowledge, as you say, the existence of this community of Americans who are making a statement of noncompliance with the system. This is a really big issue for independents in this country. So thank you so much for saying that and for bringing that issue out. I wanted to share just a couple of statistics with you and have you respond to them. It really kind of buttresses your case here. In 2018, Independent Voting did a survey of about 5,000 independents all around the country. And we asked people whether they thought that independents get the respect and the recognition that we deserve from the media, from the political parties, and from the candidates. And 87% said, no, we don't get that. Then we asked people how they feel about the very question that you just commented on in that interview, namely, you ask people how they identify themselves, but when you're an independent, there's a follow-up question that tries to channel you into a Democratic or Republican box. So we asked people whether they thought the question placed a higher value on being a Democrat or a Republican than being an independent, and 68% said yes. So independents are following this issue about how they're perceived and talked about in the public square. Tell me your thoughts about what's going on here. Why is there such a push to deny that reality?
Because it doesn't fit the media narrative and it doesn't fit the objective, which is profit-driven and only works when you can pit people against one another, namely R's against D's, red state versus blue state. There's a whole cottage industry that exists, subsists based on the narrative of the two parties fighting one another. And bridging the gap and trying to talk about common denominators and areas that we have in common is totally at odds with this. Unfortunately, we live in a society where the media world is now driven by mouse clicks and eyeballs to television programs, namely cable television programs, and ears to radio programs. And we are so fragmented, and we've all clustered in our media silos that are reflective of one view or the other. And the fact that you've got this plurality, 42% who are out there agreeing with some of what's on one side and some of what's on the other, it just doesn't fit into those boxes. So in a nutshell, I blame the media, which may sound odd for someone who the last 3 decades has earned his keep behind a microphone. But I've had a front row seat for the whole transformation of this process, which I'm happy to speak at length about or not. And so while I recognize that there are many factors that drive the issues that bring us together, open primaries, absolutely, or the lack of open primaries are on that list, and dark money is on that list, and self-sorting is on that list, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But time and again, I come back and I say, above all else, it's the media that has an outsized influence. The head of the Republican Party today is not Ronna McDaniel, it's Tucker Carlson. Let's admit it and try and deal with that reality. So that really is what drove me in this direction, because I've been a part of that ecosystem for a long time, for 20 years, wrapped up in it, and then hit a break point in my life where I said, man, this is driving the country into a ditch. And whether there's a successful career path in it for me or not, I don't know, but I got to live with myself and get out of this mold. And that's really what I did in 2010, having been a registered Republican from 1980 through that year.
Yeah. Well, just a follow-up question here. When we've talked at length with independents who come to become independents from all across the spectrum, different walks of life, different political orientations, different parts of the country. And yet at the same time, there's just certain commonalities that keep showing up. People want to be able to vote for the person, not the party. They don't want to be channeled into an ideological category. They don't like the system. They think that the parties are corrupt and self-serving. And part of what's happening now is, if you look at the elections, like, independents are deciding the results of major national elections. They broke for Obama in 2008 by 8 points. They broke for Trump in 2016 by 4 points. Then they swung all the way back to Biden by 13 points. And now independent support for Biden is falling off a cliff. So it seems to me in that kind of environment, the idea that you're going to deny that there's this whole echelon, this whole community of Americans who are not buying into those structures and those categories, it's really hard to hold on to that denial.
Well, I agree with that. We're not a monolithic group. I mean, among the 42%, there's tons of disagreement, but what unites us is there's something lacking in the R's and the D's, 20, 25%, whatever they may be. We're not getting from them what we would like. I think something else that unites the 42% is that for us, compromise is not a dirty word. And it's just a sort of having reached our level of disgust with both parties and wanting something that thus far hasn't been offered to us. Of course, there are a lot of systemic obstacles to giving voice to the 42% to be able to take control of this situation. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. But I, Jackie, believe that the tools are there, that the situation is ripe for someone or some group of individuals to come along and harness the strength from the center. It's kind of funny because I said this to Paul in that clip that you paid, or I was hinting at this. What I most resent is the criticism that somehow if you're not aligned with one party or the other, if you're not at one end of the ideological spectrum or the other, then you're somehow pliable, you're squishy, you're lacking in opinions on issues.
Right.
I have opinions on all the issues, but they just don't stack up in those faux boxes, which when you analyze them either on the left or the right, what really is the glue that holds together your perspective on foreign policy, to think of what's top of mind today, and domestic policy or social issues? There's nothing that obligates you to have a position on defense that translates into the societal safety net. And somehow we've come to accept the fact that, this is what you believe, then I guess you believe in this checklist as well. Those are not the people I interact with. And I know that some will say, well, maybe it's a reflection of where you live or your own social circle. But when I am leading what I think is a very normal life of grocery shopping, back to school nights when our kids were younger, just being at the local grocery store, the people that I interact with, the issues are a mixed bag. They're conservative on many things, usually the fiscal issues, and much more progressive or liberal on a whole host of social issues. And yet you'd never know that if you landed here from a different planet and turned on a cable outlet or listened to a radio program. You'd think that it's a completely monolithic society, right, and it's not.
Michael, when you think about the growing numbers of people that are identifying as independents, registering as independents, do you think that a portion of that, in addition to, as you're saying, people have a wide variety of views that don't fit into these neat partisan boxes, but is another part of it also people are just insulted by the kind of polarizing media diet that's put out there, the kind of the pressure, the societal pressure to pick a team? Is part of it just do you think people just don't like that?
Well, I think that the better known names politically today are the social media bomb throwers. The way you used to get ahead in Washington was to be elected, to bide your time, achieve seniority, become a committee chair, and then get something done. And today it requires none of that. It is just say something inflammatory, something incendiary, and you're a fundraising magnet. The top of mind example that I have is Lauren Boebert, Congresswoman Representative Boebert, shouting out at the State of the Union last week, a la Joe Wilson, who did so years prior. I didn't go back and look at the numbers, but I'm sure that if I looked at how she did the following 24, 48 hours, she would have been a fundraising magnet. We've come to reward all the bad behavior. And that bad behavior, to your point, is what I think people see in politics, sure, and get turned off.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question on the media front too, since, you're so great at hammering away and I love to listen to you do it. But I know that you've talked about media consumption on the part of the public, right? And how people have to be more circumspect or find ways to break through, okay, all of the reinforcement of tunnel vision and ideological polarization, et cetera, and so forth that's brought forth by the media. So something I wanted to bring to your attention and ask you to comment on is that a close colleague of mine, Dr. Tom Riley, who I work with, we've just opened up a new center at Arizona State University called the Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy. And we're going to be really looking at a lot of these issues now and doing some new research to try to drive this conversation up from behind the scenes and just in your studio to everyone in the country. But one of the things that Dr. Riley found in a recent study that he did was that Democrats, not unexpectedly, tended to get their news and information, right, from media sources that reinforced their pre-existing views. And the same was true for Republicans. But independents, he found in this survey, actually do something different, which is that they like to go to a cross-section of news and information sources. They like to see what the right has to say, see what the left has to say, see what the center has to say, and use that as part of a process of formulating a more independent orientation or a more independent way of thinking about things. So that's an important discovery, I think, first of all. But second of all, do you think there's a role that independents can play in helping Americans break out of their media blindness, if you will, and help people develop a new way of consuming information and news?
So in September, this past September, I do a great deal of public speaking to radio and television listeners across the country in small theaters, at least in a pre-COVID era, and also to private groups for hire. This event was neither. It was an invitation that I received to speak at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley in September, which for me was very prestigious to go out in that forum. I literally spoke under the Air Force One that flew Ronald Reagan around the globe. And it was a spectacular setting, and the sun was setting in the Southern California mountains, and there was a sold out crowd of 500 people there. So I put a lot of thought into what's the message that I'm going to deliver. I know it is going to be recorded. And by the way, it's on my YouTube channel. The speech that I delivered is titled, "It's Time to Change the Channel." And what I do in 40 minutes is to go through my own observation, my own career, note the changes that I've seen. And then the pitch that I make at the end is to mix up your media diet. I mean, I don't go to bed at night if I'm available without watching what Rachel Maddow has to say, what Sean Hannity has to say, and whomever is in the 9 o'clock hour. It used to be Chris Cuomo, of course, on CNN. I mean, I want to take it all in and lead by example and be able to react to all of those personalities on my own radio program. Here's the one commercial I'll deliver in our time together today. I have a daily newsletter. It seems like everybody has a daily newsletter these days. But what's unique about mine is that it basically consists of 20 aggregated links that I hand select. Nobody has to pay for the newsletter. We started it not long ago. We have 65,000 daily subscribers. They're registrants, really. But I draw from Breitbart and from Fox News and from whomever might be on the right and saying something of interest. But I also will give you Slate and Salon and the lead editorial of the New York Times. And the premise is that even if paywalls hinder access, you could spend 3 minutes and scroll tomorrow morning what I've hand selected, and you'll get some balance. And I think that that's most what people are lacking. I mean, those revelations from Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, about how they manipulated the news feed so as to cause engagement, and what sells? Anger, stirring the pot, getting people angry at political opponents, was so illuminating for me, because I think we've all come to know that, you know, if you go on in a commercial sense online and you're looking for a product, maybe you want to travel, maybe you want to buy a chair, something, you know, pedestrian, all of a sudden you notice what? That now you go back online and you're bombarded with ads for whatever that product was because they have your number. I don't think we fully appreciated that it's the same thing on issues, and that people who think they're well-read because they're getting their news feed from Facebook and they're sampling a lot of different areas, they don't realize that algorithms have determined what they're going to receive. So we're surrounded by these temptations to be reinforced, to your point, in our views instead of seeking out alternative points of view. That's what we most need. We've got to change the channel.
Yeah. I was talking with Jeff Bukes, who used to run Time Warner, and see it. He ran CNN, I guess, or the parent company of CNN, and he was expressing exactly what you were saying about the algorithms and how insidious they are, because people don't know it. They don't know that they're being channeled into these silos in which they're just getting reinforced as opposed to being exposed to a lot of different ideas. Is that, I'm not asking you to put your conspiracy hat on here, but is that just a pure economic engine that drives that? Or is there, like, what, I know you mentioned it's a cottage industry, but say more about that, like what's pushing that along?
Well, if you're asking me if the personalities who are household names believe what they tell us, my answer is largely no. I've rubbed shoulders with too many of them to believe otherwise. Are some of them clear thinking ideologically? Yeah, some of them are. But my gosh, take a look at any number of them and go back years if you have the ability and find out what they were saying in a different time period. I don't want to beat up on only Tucker Carlson. He's top of mind because Eric Wemple outed him in a piece for the Washington Post within the last 2 weeks, going back and seeing the things that he had said about Putin and Russia back when he was an MSNBC host, and then comparing to where he is today. And by the way, I'm allowing for changes of heart. My own views have certainly shifted in a lot of respects, but I'm sorry, I do see profit motive in most of it. And by the way, it's easy. It's easy if you're a person in the cable realm or a radio host, if you only do the talking points. How much easier my show would be to produce for tomorrow morning if I simply adopted what's coming from the left or adopted what's coming from the right, because then you just have to parrot what everybody else is saying. You just have to grab an editorial from National Review, in one sense, or go over to MSNBC in another and toe the party line. It's much harder to run through headlines and say, well, I think in this case, the conservatives have a correct point that they're making, but alternatively, on something else, it's the Democratic side of the aisle. It's a much heavier workload, and I think many of them are not willing to do it.
Got it. One more thing we wanted to explore with you, Michael, and then open it up. We already have a lot of questions coming in, and I want to leave a lot of time for audience participation. But here at Open Primaries, we work on open primaries. We're kind of seeped in that issue. We work on it all over the country. But one of the things that we've been going through is that the more you look at the primary system and how it excludes independent voters, how it silos voters, it reinforces all these trends that you're talking about. It segregates voters. Is you learn just how unusual the United States is, in that we are the only Western democracy that puts partisans in charge of every aspect of the electoral process, not just the primaries. The parties run the debates, they run the boards of elections, they run the redistricting commissions, they run the legislatures, they run every, we don't have a firewall between the parties and the government, between the parties and the running of elections. Every other country in the world does that. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to kind of what kind of structural reforms that we need, not just the laundry list, but like what do we need to reform in this country from your perspective?
Well, first of all, on the subject of open primaries, this is really a sore spot with me because I'm a Pennsylvanian, lifelong Pennsylvanian. I happen to think that right now we have the hottest US Senate race in the nation. The question, who is going to fill the seat currently held by Pat Toomey? And there's a very competitive race on the Democratic side of the aisle. There's a very competitive race on the Republican side of the aisle. Now look at me. I think we call those in Pennsylvania who are neither non-party affiliates or nonpartisan affiliates. I don't know. That's the independent label. I have no say. So the primary is May 17. This one election might determine, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say this, but this one election might determine which party controls the US Senate. So what should I do? And this is an issue right now that I'm wrestling with. Should I go register? Should I size up which of these primaries I think my voice could be better heard in, register as an R, register as a D, and then go back to being the Pennsylvania form of an I? It's ridiculous that I should have to do that. And Unite America, which is probably an affinity organization for this group, just took a look at what went on in Texas a week or 10 days ago. By their calculation, 8.5% of Texas voters participated in the congressional elections, and 36, I hope I get these numbers right, I'm pretty close if I'm off, but 36 of the 38 Texas congressional races are predetermined based on who won the primary. In other words, nobody participated in the primary election, and those very few who did are now dictating 36 of the 38 because there won't be a competitive general election. That's outrageous. That needs to be reformed. On the presidential level, there's this sort of catch-22 where you need to have 15% of the vote in a variety of polls in order to get on the debate stage. Well, how do you get to 15%? You get to 15% by earning your keep on the debate stage.
Right.
And so here we talk about 42% of voters being unrepresented in the 3 presidential debates and the 1 vice presidential debate. That needs to change.
Yeah, when you talk about Texas, I wish it was just Texas, but that's the norm now. We just did a study, Open Primaries, at the fact that nationally, 48% of state legislators that got elected in 2020, 48% ran unopposed in November, not token opposition. There was one name on the ballot.
John, the thing I have to say about this, and I a little hat tip to David Wasserman from the Cook Political Report and Bill Bishop, who wrote The Big Sort, I do feel obligated to say we have a serious gerrymandering problem in this country, for sure. But there's something else in the water. We are self-sorting. And Bishop wrote his book in 2008 and saw it coming. Charles Murray, in Coming Apart, I think has some of the same thoughts in his academic research, where whether people are doing it deliberately or not, we are and the internet makes it easier to do this. We are gravitating toward the like-minded. We don't have common experiences anymore. Military used to be a unifier when more would undertake military service, but now people are living in their gated communities, real or virtual, and your kids are going to school with the same type of people, and you're socializing with the same type of people. And the internet allows you to find people who are into macrame, or into, whatever that very narrow area of avocation that you might have. And we're just not, I don't know what the word is, cross-pollinating, spending time with people who don't look like us. That's a big part of the problem.
Michael, I just want to ask you one more thing here before we open up. What are people saying to you, like offline, off the screen, people in the industry, people in politics? What are they saying to you about the fact that you're being so outspoken about these issues?
Well, either they shun me, either they shun me, or some tell me it's almost like the congressional equivalent, where people vote one way and then they privately believe something else. I mean, there are a lot who say you're absolutely right, and it's gone too far, and we need to make changes. And there are many more who are just, will call me, I don't understand this, I'm supposedly the sellout. The worst thing I could have done, for my career, when I was in talk radio and made this a full-time endeavor, of course, the ego of it got to me. I think it gets to most. And I was in a big market doing morning drive with good ratings. So of course I decided, hey, I'm doing this in Philadelphia. The material wouldn't be much different. I'd like to play on a national stage. And I finally got my wish at the time of the 2008 election, and then decided that I was not going to vote for a Republican for the first time in 30 years. Now I had a decision to make. Am I going to admit it on air? Nobody's putting a gun to my head. But in the end, I decided that I didn't want to tell people how they should vote, but I did want to explain how I'd be casting my ballot. And that's when it all hit the fan for me. And it was not a safe career path in 2008, just as I was being syndicated. I remember when I changed my party affiliation to independent in 2010, I had just received a beachhead, a radio station in New York City. Of course, that was a very big deal, biggest market in the country. I was put on the air. I'll name the station. It was WOR. And this was like a lifelong, career-long dream to have your voice heard in New York City. When I wrote an essay that was published in one of the Philadelphia newspapers saying I was now an independent, a missive came down from that station management that said, if this, quote, keeps up, then they would have to make a change with my time slot. In other words, keep speaking your independence and we will have to get rid of you.
Wow.
Those are the built-in landmines. So I would like to think that with my own small platforms, small but getting larger, that I'm proving you don't need to play like that. You don't need to adopt that model, and you can still have a successful career and say things you really believe.
Yeah,
That's great.
We'd love for you to keep going.
Yeah. All right, we're going to open it up. Just a reminder to everybody: if you have a question, put it in the text. I'll call on you and just say your name and ask your question. Take yourself off mute and say your name and ask your question. So our first question comes from Elaine Stephen in Kansas and has a question about educating people about their political options. Go ahead, Elaine.
Hi. Many people are still in both parties and they lean independent, but they don't think that they can accomplish anything outside of the parties. So how do we help people who are in the parties but want to be independent understand, A, that being independent is possible, and B, understand what the problems are with the party system and why it's not going to change unless we actually work to reform it?
Elaine, I am of a certain age. I don't think you are, as I take a look at you, that I had civics as part of my, public school K through 12 education. Did you have civics in Kansas as part of your basic education?
I wasn't here at the time, but.
Okay. So my point is, I think this is kind of a bigger subject, but in the education, quote unquote, reforms that we had, where we were instilling competition and trying to get more out of educators. And what was the result? Lots and lots of testing, standardized testing of American school students. Some things fell by the wayside. Some courses fell by the wayside. Home ec was something that I had. Woodshop was something that I had. Civics was a course that I had. I hope that I'm wrong, but I think many Americans lack a fundamental understanding of the way our government functions. One of sort of the annual radio programs that I'll do is to focus on the naturalization process and ask radio listeners questions from the exam that someone not born here needs to pass or achieve a certain score in order to become an American citizen. And we have fun with it. And I would like to tell you that my radio listeners are smarter than anybody else's radio listeners. But there are always those moments where people just can't answer some of the very basics. So that would be the starting point. The starting point would be to figure out how we can educate at an early stage some of the very basics of government. And then the second part that I would say is this 42% message. Like, there's got to be a brand somewhere in here that we can rally a flag around 42%. Because the more, do you remember the argument that was advanced for the Equal Rights Amendment or for equal pay for women? I'm embarrassed to tell you, I don't know what the number was, but it was like a cent, a numerical reading. And what exactly is that? Oh, that's how much the average woman makes for the average, in comparison to the average man. Maybe this 42% thing needs to get trumpeted to let people know there's strength in numbers. Wow, I'm not the aberrant one. Actually, we're a plurality of the country.
That's a great point. All right, our next question is from Aaron James in Tennessee, who has a whole bunch of questions about why we do things the way we do them. Go ahead, Aaron. Aaron, you still there?
I forgot to unmute myself. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
there you go. Hi, Aaron.
So the first time I heard you speak, John, you made a statement that just has stuck in my head ever since. And that is that the parties are not the government. Okay. And that's such a brilliant statement. So my question is, why are their primary elections publicly funded? The third parties, when they have to narrow down their field of candidates, that happens within their own ranks and at their expense. So why should it be any different for Republicans?
It shouldn't be. I mean, to your point, Aaron, as a Pennsylvanian, I'm paying for the administration of a closed primary process that I'm shut out of and I wish to participate in. I should know the answer to this, and I don't. I don't know to what extent that whole premise has been litigated. If it hasn't been, it should be. It's a great argument for those of us who want to have a say, because we're shut out of a process that is born of taxpayer expense.
Well, but my point is not that we should participate in their process. My point is it shouldn't be publicly funded. Because by making, and I'm going to read this so I get it right, by making the parties' primaries a public process funded by public monies and run by public agencies, that only serves to ingrain their we versus they politics more deeply into the very functioning of government itself. I don't care to participate in a Republican or Democrat primary. I think it has to be a private process within their own ranks, just like it is within the third parties. And then everyone is represented equally and fairly in the general.
Well, I like your point more in view of what we saw in 2020 and what I fear happening in 2024. In other words, even without the argument that we need to have more voices of independence, from a ballot security and integrity standpoint, I'm concerned about what's to come in the next election. And if there were a way to depoliticize it, I think that would be healthy. David Litt wrote a book, the title of which I don't remember, but I always think of him because he had this great explanation of what elections are in America. And he said it's essentially what we do is we create a pop-up Starbucks all over the country. We staff it with novices, and then we're surprised when, you know, some of the coffee turns out lukewarm instead of boiling hot. And it's so true. I mean, it's amazing that we haven't had more problems given the way we conduct our elections.
Yeah, just to add to that, Aaron, I think that within the primary reform arena right now, there's a lot of debate and discussion on this very question, which is, hey, do we focus on reforming the primaries, opening them up, or do we focus on, hey, if you're a party, if you want to have a primary, pay for it yourself? And I think what I'm advocating and we're advocating is do both. As long as they're publicly funded, allow for the most participation as possible. And in fact, change the model, get away from party primaries and do what we did in California, Washington, Alaska, and Nebraska, which is go to a public primary where you're no longer choosing the nominees. You're choosing which candidates go from the first round to the second round, regardless of party rather. But I think your point is very well raised, and it hasn't been fully litigated yet. And we're hoping to get to that in the next couple of years.
They're in the preliminary discussions now of closing the primaries in Tennessee. And if they do, it will be litigated.
Yeah.
I can tell
All
you.
right. Definitely. A question for you, Michael, from Mike Koenig in Georgia about the media. And well, I'll let you ask it, Mike, because it's a very philosophical question. Go ahead.
Michael, appreciate you being here. A big fan, follower of all your shows. Have your book. I didn't get it signed when you were in Atlanta. Not holding that against you. But um, opportunity to hear your thoughts on the subject that we're talking about today is especially appreciated. But you mentioned, and I've heard you mention that before, that the media is the problem. And we have this sort of endless debate about what is the root cause, and more importantly, what will have the biggest impact and have the biggest opportunity to make the biggest, have the biggest opportunity to move us in the direction of solutions. If the media is the problem, do you think the media is reacting and a response? Is it the cause or the effect? Is it responding to the environment, or is it causing the environment? And
Causing. There's no, I may be wrong, but I'm firm in my view.
Mhm.
I want to tell you a quick story, and I hope I won't get long-winded. So it was in the late 1980s that I began doing talk radio work as a fill-in host in Philadelphia. And I often reflect on the radio station where I cut my teeth, because it was typical of what talk radio was across the country at the time. Ideology did not matter. We had a libertarian. Frankly, the rest of us weren't even sure what that meant, because Ron and Rand Paul had yet to come on the scene. We had a conservative. He wasn't known for his conservatism. He was known for his command of the English language. He was very well spoken. We had a pair of liberals. We had a travel show. We had a music show. We had a sex show. I mean, it was a whole composite of different programming, and the objective was to make the telephones ring. And that's what I was schooled on when I first began work as a talk radio host. And that's the way talk radio was all across the country. At the end of the 80s, in 1988, the fairness doctrine ended. That's where I thought you were going with your question. And there was a Sacramento-based talk radio host who had great success, so much so that for the first time on this scale, he was put into national syndication. And of course, that was Rush Limbaugh. And overnight, I saw the business change, and it was no longer premised on making the phones ring, but it was premised on ideology. At that time, pre-internet, pre-cable news, conservatives, I think, rightfully felt like they were shut out of the dynamic. And that model then took off. Fox News came online in 1996. They emulated that model. MSNBC struggled for their voice. You may or may not remember that Phil Donahue was one of their first big name hosts. Then they started to mimic from the left what Fox was doing from the right. I don't want to get into a question of whataboutism, but the whole model took off as we entered the internet age, and there it has remained. Something else happened in 1988. Not only Limbaugh's syndication, but a brash New York-based developer made his maiden voyage to New Hampshire and said he was contemplating running for office, presidency. Well, Trump didn't run in 88 or in 92 or in 96, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't run until 2016. And the stage had now been set. The table had been set for him, because I maintain Republican primary voters in particular were now schooled and ready to vote for someone who looked like, sounded like their favorite talk radio host. And to me, in a nutshell, that's really, if he had run sooner, he wouldn't have won. But by then, the discourse in this country was so controlled by talking heads that it was perfectly suited for him and for his election. So that's how I see the short version of where it began. And that is why, I mean, could speak about this for hours on end, but that's why I think it's not as if the hosts were sizing up the situation and reflecting the will of the people. And one other thing, if I can just say this, John, is that if you go back to Ronald Reagan's watch, if you go back to the 1980s, 60% of the Senate was comprised of moderates, and similar in the House of Representatives. Today, there are none left. I mean, how many times can you mention Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski? I don't see correlation in the changes in Washington and the changes in the media. I see causation. And afforded more time here, I'd make that case. Watch my speech at the Reagan Library, where I lay it all out over the course of an hour.
I'm convinced. All right, two questions. First, we're going to go to David Thornburg in Pennsylvania, who has a question about the emerging open primaries effort there. And then I want to go to Melvin Burris, who has a question about developing strategies to empower independent voters. But David, let me throw it to you first.
Thanks, John. Michael, always great to see you. Thanks for chipping in here. One quick note on Pennsylvania primaries this year. I think this is the first primary in Pennsylvania's history where we had an open governor seat, open Senate seat, new state House and Senate maps, and new congressional maps all at the same time. All the more outrageous then that we're keeping 1.1 million voters away from the polls. But now my question, so you may have seen, I'm now leading an effort called Ballot PA to repeal closed primaries in Pennsylvania and allow independents in. As you know, we live not in an initiative state, but in a legislative state that is controlled by the Republican Party, at least in the General Assembly. You're well familiar with the Republican Party, past and present. My question to you is, what message do you think would best resonate to the Republican Party circa 2020 that would help put this proposal over the goal line, as it were?
Well, we live in an archaic state when it comes to these things. One of my longstanding bones of contention was absentee balloting only for cause. I never thought, David, that in my lifetime we'd be able to get rid of it. And yet we have. And so it's given me a whole sense of optimism. Now, of course, the trade-off there was, as you would know even better than I would know, that the trade-off there was to get rid of so-called big ticket voting. Yep. But the fact that that came to pass, I mean, it used to be, unless you were going to be out of the jurisdiction, you had to be voting in person. And I know that there's litigation on this issue as we speak, and it's not yet resolved whether we're going to be able to keep it. I think we will. But the fact that that got done makes me optimistic that maybe this too can get done. But I think you're going to have to give something to Republicans like was given to them to go along with absentee balloting without cause. I hope I said that correctly. I think that I did. So a pure argument about the 1.1 million, I don't think cuts it. It's too partisan. Both sides look at this as, do we benefit or do we lose if this change comes to pass? So maybe you could tell me, what can you offer in return for Republicans to be able to go along with this?
Yeah, we should catch up offline, but our polling suggests that this is equally popular among Trump Republicans as it is folks on the other side of the spectrum.
I believe that.
So that's the job. We've got to translate that message. And by the way, as you know, this proposal passed a couple of years ago with strong Republican support. So, but more to come. But thanks so much for pitching. Well, good luck. You have such a great voice on these issues.
Thanks, David. All right, we're going to go to Melvin Burris. A couple different questions about strategy. Go ahead, Melvin. You got to take yourself off mute.
Michael, thank you, Joe. Michael, I'm a long-time follower of your program. I'm originally from New York and Connecticut. But my question is, if we're all independents, how do we strategize the other major parties to do what's right for the betterment of the community? As you were saying, the conservatives have taken over the media. There is no moderates, as you were referring to. And so somebody has to have a voice to talk up about those who have no voice. What is your suggestion?
I'm one who believes that maybe small change would equal big change, and that if you could get elected to the United States Senate, just a few independents. Look at the attention that is heaped upon Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin right now. If there were 4 or 5 like them whose votes were not a preordained conclusion, they would have the total control right now of our government. And I don't think in necessarily a bad way. I think in a good way, because all power would then emanate from those independent voices. So, if we could convince some candidates who are out there and able to self-fund, I put my cards on the table and tell you that I personally was disappointed when Michael Bloomberg decided to run as a D and not as an I. And obviously, as a candidate, we saw his shortcomings on that debate stage. But if there was someone, a named person, someone for whom the funding wouldn't be a problem, who could run a legitimate campaign as an independent and win a US Senate seat, I think that would be a huge step forward on all the issues that we're talking about.
Well, we saw Perot run as an independent. It didn't work out too well. And you just mentioned two Democrats who ran as Democrats. How do you get independents elected in this kind of media and scenario?
Well, but if we're correct that 42% is a real number, or something close to 42% is a real number, it's out there to be harvested. It's out there to be harnessed is probably a better word. I maybe I'm naive, but I think that a credible candidate or candidates who would step forward and run in this environment would do extremely well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, Melvin. We have a number of people, Michael, that want to ask you about what kind of reforms you think would be top of your list. Steve Barrett and also Eric Bronner. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve to ask the question. And Eric, sorry, I'm giving you the short shrift, but we had multiple people asking the same question. So Steve is going to take point on that. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, Michael. You know, you don't have to be too connected to know that there's a bunch of people that want term limits, and a bunch of people that want ranked choice voting, and a bunch of people that want open primaries, and a bunch of people that want redistricting reform. But as you pointed out, the people who are in charge of those things are benefiting from that status quo. And so I'm not sure it's realistic or reasonable to expect them to upset their own apple cart. So I live in New Jersey, which has all of the benefits that the gentleman from Pennsylvania mentioned and you mentioned, with the additional called the county line, where the parties decide who their chosen candidate will be. That's a preferable spot on the primary ballot. So
did you hear my question?
There is a question here somewhere. What are the chances that we can do these reforms through in statutory states such as New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where I'm just trying to ask about what your thoughts are on initiative and referendum, and whether that's a shorter path to realizing the necessary reforms.
Well, I reflect on what I said with David Thornburg a few moments ago. I was pleasantly surprised because I had written off my own state on the issue of for-cause absentee balloting, and yet that deal got done in a very pragmatic fashion. So maybe it's not the lost cause that we think it is. I mean, I hear the list that you've articulated, and I'm for each one of those reforms. I think the last time that we took a look at term limits, it was in the late 80s or early 90s on a national basis, and there's been no momentum for that since that time. And yet, it's one of these issues like ranked choice voting that if you poll on it, we've all seen the data, these are things that Americans want. So this is not a real good answer, Steve, but perhaps movements like that which you've begun here, and letting people look at a screen like this and see just how many of us are intent on moving this forward, could change the dynamic. I mean, I really believe that there's strength in numbers, and that if we only recognized how many of us feel this way and fought the Gallup presentation of the data, we'd move the ball demonstrably forward.
Well, I just last comment. I know that all the states you talked about that have done some of these reforms, like Alaska, they're the model for all of us, have done it through initiative and referendum and not through the partisan legislatures.
Agreed.
So
yep.
Thanks.
California likewise. Yep.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we've just got a few minutes left. I want to go to Michael Eng in Oregon, who has a question about independents' relationship to the redistricting process. Go ahead, Michael.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for taking the question. In Oregon and in many other states, redistricting maps are evaluated based on their partisan bias. And most of the more recently developed software that analyze redistricting maps only use the number of votes that were cast for R's and D's in the previous election to evaluate partisan bias, which is required actually in some states. What are your thoughts on ensuring that the interests of independents are taken into consideration during the redistricting process? Because right now they're not considered at all.
I think I'm aware of the issue in Oregon that you're referencing, and I think it's terrible. And I think that people are shortchanged who are not accounted for in that process. And what surprised me is that maybe I have an uninformed view of Oregon, but I thought that's the state or one of the states where things would be handled differently and that they would afford a seat at the table. But it just doesn't seem fair to those of us who regard ourselves as independent.
Yeah, I made a pitch for instead of using the results of elections to actually use registration data.
Sure.
You know, and so that now we call them non-affiliated voters here instead of independents, but they would become a community of interest at that point that has to be taken into consideration.
I think it's a great point. I mean, to go back to my example where I may have to sit out the primary unless I register in one of the parties, it's entirely possible. I mean, this is not the way I'll roll, but it's entirely possible that the two candidates who emerge, neither will be to my satisfaction. If I sit home, in the Oregon model, I should be cut out of that process. That doesn't seem fair. That just seems to compound my being excluded from the process.
Thanks, Michael. Final question. We're going to turn it over to Sal Albanese, former New York City council member and mayoral candidate, to take us into the 5 o'clock hour. So go ahead, Sal.
Thank you, John. Good evening, Michael. I'm a big fan. And I want to get your opinion on what we're trying to do in New York City. I'm the head of a group that is organizing around single ballot elections and ranked choice voting in the general election, which is the Alaska model. Which successfully just passed. And New York City has a broken political system. We have 17.5% of all registered voters elected the mayor and the primary, which is, of course, the election here in New York City. About 9% of all registered voters elected the public advocate and the controller. So 1.2 million independents in New York City were left out of the process. The general election is a joke here because it's so heavily Democratic, and there were lots of folks that are just not part of the process. So we're promoting an initiative for competitive elections. We've got a citywide coalition going. We do have the initiative and referendum option in New York City, which is why we have term limits, by the way. That passed back in the 90s. So we're attempting to do this. We're working with some groups, John's group, John Opdycke, and also the Institute for Innovative Politics, which was very helpful in Alaska. I wanted your opinion on our effort. And obviously, if you think it's a good idea, we would love for you to talk about it at some point.
Sal, I don't know that I have enough knowledge to make this statement, but I paid attention to the New York City election, the mayoral election, because of ranked choice voting. And I don't know if there was a clear answer in the end as to whether it benefited Eric Adams, whether we can look at candidates who didn't come out because of the model. But I really liked what I saw, notwithstanding the delay that they had in counting those ballots. That probably was a setback in a small way for the movement. But I thought that was a pretty good microcosm of the way things ought to be done. And from a distance, from 90 miles away, with its imperfections, I thought it was the wave of the future. What did you think?
Well, I was on the Charter Revision Commission that passed ranked choice voting. I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting, but it doesn't do the trick. You still have 1.2 million voters that are left out of the loop. You still have a non-competitive general election. What we're trying to do is combine the two. Right. Nonpartisan in the primary and then ranked choice voting in the general election. because ranked choice voting alone just doesn't do it. We have a lot of folks that are out of the loop. And once again, we have non-competitive general elections. Under our proposal, you would have a top 5 in the general election and a real competitive election. So ranked choice voting was a small step in the right direction, but it's just inadequate in terms of reforming politics in New York City.
The objective, I like what you've said. The objective is to make it easier for candidates to get elected who are bridge builders and who are not just appealing to a very small but hardcore, passionate base. Reasonable people have surrendered the playing surface to the most passionate among us. In the end, they're the ones who will put up a yard sign, walk through fire to vote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, even if they're not represented in the greatest number. So we need to instill reforms where those folks aren't enough to get you elected. They're a good base, but you've got to be able to extend a hand if you really want to be elected. I wish I had something better to offer you, but I like what you said. So I endorse it all.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
Hey, my pitch, if I could just say, John and Jackie, thank you for having me. What a nice group of folks. Very intelligent questions. I don't know that my answers were up to snuff, but I appreciate being in your company. Please go register for my newsletter. It won't cost you anything. And hold me accountable, not on one day. Take a look at 3 or 4 days and make up your own mind as to whether I'm achieving my goal of giving you a balanced media diet. Our slogan is balanced, delivered daily. You go to smerconish.com, fill in your email address, and tomorrow morning at 7:30, 7:45 in your in bin, you'll see how I'm doing.
Well, that's great, Michael. And I just want to say that with a lot of gratitude, you are bringing up and shining a light on issues that independent Americans in this country have been concerned about for decades. And having a voice like yours who's beating the drum on the issue of if you say you're an independent, you are an independent. It doesn't matter who you voted for in the last cycle. What you call yourself in the United States of America is the most important thing. So thank you for that. And we'll be paying lots of attention to your work and make sure that you keep that voice, keep that drumbeat going. It's so important to the future of this country.
Thank you. That's awfully nice. Have a great day, everybody.
It really is. Thank you so much and take care. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. See you soon, I hope. Thank you.
Bye.